Now moving right along to the President's report. Rather than reading a whole lengthy report that's in your booklets, I thought I'd just give a bit of a brief outline of some of the things that I felt have been important over the last few years. Also, a brief comment on the Victorian scene, on the election, the national agenda, and then some of the challenges that VASP faces in the coming years. In terms of our last 4 years, I think from a VASP point of view, we've got a lot to be very proud of and content with, I suppose, in terms of our organisation. Certainly we've got our strategic plan revamped and put into place for the coming years. We've put in place a new constitution, although we have found a few words that needs to be removed, and that will be done at the SGM next year. We've got a strong focus and have had a strong focus on member support and support for individuals through our field services, our project services, and our forums and workshops, both at our offices and outside in regional areas as well to some extent. There's been a lot of sharing of best practice in terms of those forums, workshops and our regional meetings. We've got a lot of members engaged in policy development and impacting on policy, certainly through the executive, through the committee, through regional groups, but also a lot of individual members who have represented VASP on a whole, I suppose, plethora of committees that the department has set up over the last 4 years, and at times I've almost felt embarrassed having to ask people again, can you go to this next meeting, to try and give some input from a principal's perspective and a VASP perspective. So I've been very much involved in that. I think we've been very strong on advocacy for the principal class and for state education. We've got, I think, pretty strong relationships with the department, but also very willing conversations with the department at the same time, and I can relate to that a little bit later on. We've got very strong, well I shouldn't say strong relationships, but ready contact with the Minister and the advisors, so if we need to have a conversation, it's very easy to get in touch with them and they will listen and they will have a conversation. As to whether they will act in the way that we would want them to is another thing altogether, but I think it's really important that VASP has got that presence where it can have the conversations with the upper echelons of the department and with the politicians and their advisors when we need to. Certainly with the opposition, we've had significant conversations over the last year in regard to education policy, meetings with James Molino and his advisor on a number of occasions, even just over the last month, but certainly in previous times as well. I think we've got fairly strong relationships with the media. Certainly from my point of view, they're in touch with me regularly, but certainly a good number of you here as well have had phone calls from the media where I've passed on your names and your phone numbers after getting permissions at committee and the like, of course, to have people make comment on media issues that are of importance to us in state secondary education. I believe we've got the most cordial relationships we've had with the AEU for some time. VASP and VPA, I think we work well together, even though that the terminology of the name changed that they had some years ago from VPPA, Victorian Primary Principals Association, to Victorian Principals Association, certainly rubs a bit of salt into a bit of a wound that was created at that stage, and makes for difficult conversations with media at times because they don't know who the VPA represents, and it makes it a little bit difficult. But in terms of us working together, that's been very close. And our numbers have held and gone up a little bit over the last few years, and with the number of retirements that we see, I think that's a really good reflection on where we're at as an organisation, so it's been very good. For those people that have been part of VASP for some time, you'll have seen the pillars of the organisation, and when you join, through the strategic plan, you see what the three main pillars: supporting members, both their personal and professional growth, representing members' views with the department, and publicly advocating for principalship and public education. And that all those have been central to our work over the last 4 years, 8 years and beyond that. VASP is made up of all of you, individual members way at the bottom, but certainly our executive officer and administrative support in our offices, field officers and project officers, and people who are looking at retiring in the next year or three. You might consider, if you need a little bit of work or want a little bit of work and interest, to get in touch with Marion and Judy into the future around project officer work. I think it's really interesting stuff. The executive committee and our regional groups are really central to the operation of VASP, and I'll talk about our regional groups a little bit later on, but the executive and committee in particular have been very much involved with all our work with the department in terms of responses to positions that they were putting up and providing them with feedback. And as I mentioned a moment ago, they're the people that I call on initially to do representative work, and there are people here who have spent many hours in meetings with the department, particularly around the TVLC and then the VLC. And I wouldn't say they would stand up here and say they've been wonderful meetings and they've had a lot of impact, because the department is still learning, or has been learning over the last 4 years, as to how to try and elicit input from stakeholders. Many parts of the department are still working on the basis of presenting something, saying this is being rolled out next week, what do you think of it? And that's a little bit late. So some of those people have certainly been jaded, I think, with many of the meetings, but at the same time, there are groups within the department that have worked really well with us and taken our input to mould policy. They're also very much involved in creating our position papers and bringing forward member issues from regional groups. And of course, all our individual members, that's you, make up VASP, and your input to VASP is what makes it an alive organisation. Mentioned the VPA a moment ago. We had the couple of joint executive meetings a year. We signed off a memorandum of agreement this year. One of the things that I had built into that, which will be interesting to see how it goes, is that both organisations, when they are advertising functions like their leadership conferences and the like, they need to stipulate what their constituency largely is, because we have got a little bit irked when the VPA stands up and says, we're here representing principals. Well, they're representing primary principals and principals from P12s, just as we represent secondary principals and principals from P12s or P9s, depending on who joins us. We've developed some joint position papers. Most of our forums and workshops at the offices are joint. Often there's joint representation. Gabrielle and I will often go to meetings together to put the public school position together. Joint election platform. Our facilities are jointly owned, so the offices that you come to, if you come to Vale Street, are jointly owned with the VPA, and Marion does a little bit of work for them as well, probably too much. Marion, too much. And we've got shared administration in many ways. Right, just the Victorian scene, and earlier on when I'd go around and say there are a couple of positives and try and put that out there at regional groups, I never got a very good reception, so I stopped saying it. But I think there have been a couple of policies and approaches that have been positive in terms of what the Minister was trying to put forward and then how the department has picked that up. There has been some good consultative practices within the department, as I mentioned a moment ago, and I think that's a real positive. Downsizing, I think some of it suits a range of people here, but certainly across the board, it's certainly left many schools floating in the ether of public school education without the support that's needed. The cuts that occurred in the first year or so, they were huge cuts to the public service, to the bureaucracy in particular, and then to VCAL and the like. It's just created so many unknowns and uncertainties and isolation for many people. I believe there's been very little or almost no advocacy for public education. I found it really difficult to swallow the notion that we've got a Minister for all schools. I think he stopped saying that now after hassling him for a long time, or his advisors. But a Minister for all schools, but it is government schools that need new directions. It's government schools that need this. It's government schools that's got 20 to 40% of teachers and principals that aren't good enough, sort of stuff, the messaging from September last year. And I reckon it's really mixed messaging there in all sorts of ways. So that advocacy was a major issue over the last 4 years. There's so much fiscal uncertainty, both from a state level and the federal level. Right, all the Gonski, the better school stuff. We were expecting great things this time last year, weren't we? And that's all kind of gone by the way to a large extent. Very mixed messaging, and I keep talking about this when I'm in town, and no doubt when I meet with the Secretary again. I think next Thursday we've got meetings with him and all these depth secretaries. The messaging around when when they first came in, when the government first came in, trust, autonomy, peer reviews, peer support and the like, and where we've gone from that to an approach over the last year where we've got a lot of top-down stuff in terms of the messaging. First of all, that messaging in September, October last year about the 20 to 40%, then the way they started to roll out the review processes, the principal performance processes that turned into very much a top-down sort of approach. So it's really mixed. And the timing of that messaging has been really poor too. A number of messages, like we had that 20 to 40%, the P&D was pretty ordinary, although they did listen to us and put it off. It was all going to be rolled out fully by the end of October or so last year, but that got put off after we put a fair bit of pressure on. The work around the OH&S and asbestos annual report, and the VRQA stuff, there's been all sorts of things rolled out just in the last year, because in the previous 2.5 years very little happened apart from the major cuts to the regions and the bureaucracy. But in the last year there's been a whole range of things that they've been working hard to roll out, just so I believe, so they could say that they've actually met some of their TVLC expectations. But there have been so many holes in it. Even the OH&S one, I was hassling the department just the other day saying you've got the next one. What was it? Trips and falls, was it? The trips and falls one. So that's fine. That's one way to get people to have a look at it. But this notion that you have to look at the individual bits of paper from the teachers as to whether they've done the thing. Okay, why can't we have something that brings it all together and there's a report there? And I made the comment to the department person saying, well, I'm just amazed that please don't take this on board and do something with it, but I'm amazed that no principal hasn't rung up the Sun Herald and said Liberals came in with no red tape. I've got a school of 140 teachers. I need to see 1,400 bits of paper or whatever it is and tick them off to meet my legislative requirements. So it's just amazing stuff. So all in all, there's a great many unknowns for us in public education. And I think these 4 years have certainly created that, and have been exacerbated by the approach that the bureaucracy has taken in regard to some of the ministers' messaging from earlier on, because I certainly feel there is a bit of tension between the bureaucracy and the political side of things. And on the political side of things, you also need to realise that we've got the minister, but we've also got Premier and Cabinet and Treasury that have got more power, and they're also driving much of our agenda. Right, moving on from that, 2014 election. All of you will have received our brochures and the work that was done over the last year by VASSP, State Committee in particular, but also many regional groups. The main tenets of our proposals were around supporting students, building the facilities and capital works type stuff, employing excellent people, investing in leadership and programs to support that. And I don't know whether we'll see much in the political promises that will address much of that. Even James Molino at our conference, and certainly in conversations with him at the conference, it was great. He could get up and say, we support public education and education is number one, which is fantastic. But at the same time, in terms of policies that directly impact on you on the ground at your school with your teachers, I don't think we'll hear much about that sort of stuff before the elections. And as James said, what do voters want to see? They want to see capital works and maintenance and that sort of stuff, and that's what they vote on, so that's what they roll out. So it'll be interesting to see where the election promises go to over the next 4 weeks, and then what sort of implementation happens over the first couple of months of next year, regardless of what government's in power. I think regardless of what government's in power, I think there will be some changes in the bureaucracy, one imagines, from the whisperings that go on around the place, and that will then have an impact on the sort of messaging, I think, that comes out from the department as well. The national scene, apart from the national curriculum bits in the paper in the last week and a half or so, Pine and the leadership at the national level have not been interested at all in school education. I don't believe that any organisation that's associated with primary or secondary school education has had much of an in to have conversations with Pine over the last year. They've been very much involved in the tertiary sector and working at that level, and it's only been this last week and a half or so that they've started to put a little bit of thought into and discussion around the national curriculum and working on that through your ACARAs and AITSLs and the like. We've certainly been gonskied. I think people felt we should be much better off, given particularly Richard Bolt's messaging that every school will get 4% more on top of their budgets over the next few years each year. Well, that was the initial messaging. I don't think there are too many of you here that feel that you've got more in your budgets compared to previous years, given that you've got, say, the same number of students. Anything that you've got in your budget that's additional is really reflective of the old national partnerships low SES. If you had that before and you're well above that 0.65, you'll probably still have that there. That's part of the Gonski stuff. And we would certainly be concerned that if there is other Gonski money in there, it's been rolled into paying for the EBA and increments. And then there are certainly schools here also that are going backwards with the, given that they've got the same conditions as last year, that they're going backwards because the formula that we've got doesn't account for the your high level staff being there for year after year after year. And we have some concern that the messaging from last year around the 60-70% of staff going up their increments, that was the expectation that they were talking about last year, that may have already been built into the budgets that we received, that you received in your schools on a statewide level. So if you're one of those really high cost schools, you'll probably see that reflected, possibly see that reflected. We'll be asking Bolt about that on Thursday when we're meeting with him. Right, some challenges for us. Obviously, VASSP needs to continue to be vocal, I think. I don't believe over the last 4 years there have been many organisations or any organisations that have been constantly vocal on a professional basis around schools and what needs to be happening in schools. And I mentioned earlier on that we're working more closely with the AEU than we ever have before, and that's been good around the Gonski stuff and a couple of things. But I think VASSP is probably the organisation that's very vocal in the media and with the department and the politicians. And we need to look at working with the department on these things. Need to continue to advocate strongly for government schools, and at the same time we can do that without undermining relationships within the department, because the bulk of the department, and I'd say 95% of the department people are very much on side with public education, although you might not feel that, with what's happened over the last few years, but they are beholden to their political masters and to their bosses above that are driving particular agendas. We need to continue to drive our own, develop and drive our services to members, both individually and in groups and through our forums and the like, but also we'll try and work with the department on developing service agreements. We've got Russell going to a tender briefing this afternoon on the rollout of bricks and mortar too. Right, we've done some work with the department around this sort of stuff before, where they've employed our people to roll out messaging, not messaging convincing you that the government's policy is good, but messaging around how to interpret, say, the SRP and the plan, and that was one of the things that we did earlier this year. If we can get hold of this tender in terms of the viability of the organisation, it just provides greater viability, and also I think it provides more into the department in all sorts of ways. I think you need to be working constantly, and as I've put in the e-bulletin along the way, working with school councils to have them advocate for your school and for public education when the need arises or when they can. And I know it's not easy, papers aren't keen on picking up positive messages, but I think it is school councils and communities that make the difference in terms of politicians thinking about change and where they need, what needs to happen. The regional networks, I believe we can, I think some of our networks work amazingly well. Others still need to be G'd up a bit, but we've got so much capacity that if we believe in our networks and we arrange them appropriately and possibly employ people to help run them, and a number of networks do that, I think there's so much capacity there to influence the regional directors and to influence people above that in terms of saying, this is what we're on about, this is what we want. And I don't know whether we actually believe that we've got that capacity. And I think it's really important for you and your regional networks to take hold of that and be saying to your RDs and ARDs, we want you at these meetings, these are the dates we want you to give a briefing on. And you drive the agenda. We're still in that, we're kind of beholden to our RDs and to SARPs and the like, and on the other hand we want to have our autonomy, which we've got a lot of if we want to use it. But I think if you get involved in those networks and use them well, I think we've got so much capacity there. And alongside that is us developing the narrative of where we want public education to go to, but do that together rather than as individuals. I think as secondary schools, we're not necessarily great at networking and working well together. And I think for the future of state education, it's just pivotal that the networks that you're part of, and hopefully that's VASP in particular, but other networks as well, play a strong role in developing the narrative of what we want for public education and how it should operate. All right, now moving right along from that, I've lost track of the time, Marion.
You've got to finish now.
I'm finished. Okay. Thanks, Marion. Leadership, one of the lessons. You've heard this so many times over the years in one way or another in dealing with the department. Don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness. But some people have certainly learned, but meet your Schedule B requirements within that, because they're pretty tight. Executive for next year, Judy Crowe, Jenny Mulberg, George Porter, Harvey Wood and Heather Thompson, and I welcome all those people onto the executive. Could you put your hands together to welcome them for next year? And we see the names below there of people who are elected onto the State Committee as General Reps statewide, so also thank you for putting your hands up to be part of that State Committee, and I hope all those people and then all the reps from the regions as well who will be part of State Committee next year really enjoy that, because probably the biggest challenge we have sometimes is to say to people, you've been on here for 250 years, give somebody else a go, from the point of view that it's such a great learning experience that once people are on State Committee they often say, I want to keep going, because it is a fantastic learning experience and a great involvement. So congratulations to all those people. And a bit of a thank you to Angela, Kim, Ian, Gary, Robin and Russell, Phil who's done the website, Arthur on Principal Matters, and Marion for everything. And yes, I'm finishing up Marion. Statewide meetings next year, the dates are up on the board. If you can go to Helsinki, fantastic for the ICP, and they're the dates for the Leadership Conference next year. Okay, just before we move on to the Treasurer's report, who has to do it much faster than I've done mine, I'd like to move that the President's report be accepted. Thank you, Jenny. Seconded. Deb. All those in favour? Thank you. Anybody against? Good, thank you. Mark, Treasurer's report, please.